YouTube on my other monitor, so let's wait till that comes online.
Yeah, take care, because that can come as well with sound, and because there's a delay, it can get you a little bit confused. Yeah, take care, because that can.
Okay, yep, we're live.
Very good.
Okay, cool. So we're live, and I guess welcome everyone to our first live Q&A with me and the Sans. I guess first of all, thank you everyone for joining us today.
Hello, everyone.
Hey. So yeah, I guess we've got some questions on the comments section already. We're gonna get to that, and there's a couple of questions from the forum as well for those of you who are taking the class. I guess so. We can probably start with the one from Seth about okay, he's got as part of the course, we are using DynamDB and we are running tests against DynamDB. And he says that occasionally he runs into eventual consistency errors, whereby I guess you write something to DynamDB and then you try to read it and it's not available. So he tries to wrap around the test itself using async retry, so that you have some built-in retries, which obviously helps, but then makes your code a bit more, I guess, a bit more complicated. So his question is, how do you address this with my client, and have I seen this issue before? Yes, with DynamDB you do get that, but you can probably make it a lot better if you when you query your data, you can say the consistency level that you want to use in the query. So you can say, if you want to use a strongly consistent read, it's more expensive, slower as well, but you will be less likely to see those kind of consistency errors. But in this case, most of the time, I just if something happens frequently, then I would just like what you've done using async retry to wrap those test cases so that you get a few retries. And we've got a question from Barry as well. About Cognito, that the Cognito has max on the number of groups you can have, and the total number of groups the user can be assigned to as well. And so I guess his question is a limitation around having more dynamic groups. So for example, if you belong to a football club and the name was a group to filter down all the requests, if you want to belong to another club, when you assign the second group, you have to log in, log out to get the new group. And would a custom authorizer be good in this particular case? So I think with the way you use groups, at least the way I tend to use it for any kind of multi-tenant systems is we have the group represent the different, I guess, groups of users, and then for the tenants, I guess like a football club, they will be assigned as custom attributes, so that you have both pieces of information, what group you belong to and which club you belong to, and that's checked as the custom attribute, and you can belong to multiple clubs in that case as well. So in that case, you shouldn't run into the limit with the number of groups you can have in a Cognito user pool, as well as the number of groups that a user can belong to. So we're actually going to cover this later on in the course when we get to I think chapter 11. There's a module on how to model multi-tenant systems. We're not going to actually build it into the Twitter clone, but we are going to show you an example app and see how you can model that. Guess maybe Sans, can you talk a bit about the plans for the front-end project and some of the things you've done? You've added Vuex and a whole bunch of nice things. Maybe you can talk about what's coming up soon.
Yes. So I've been working. I mean, I took into this Twitter clone project, and I was looking at what the work that Jan did at the beginning, and I thought that it would be a good addition to include Vuex as a state management. And I spent like a couple of weeks doing the migration, and I'm happy to tell you that it's already completed. It took me few bumps, but Jan helped me out with that, and we have a working solution now, and it's completely integrated with what Jan has built so far. I also added some other bits. like infinite scrolling, which I don't know if you are excited about it, but I got it working. I think the solution is pretty elegant. It's built using a view directive. And yeah, we will be building on that base, like that foundation with Vuex, which makes things, I think, a little bit more professional on the client side. And yeah, we're using Tailwind CSS, which makes things a little bit, sparkle on the UI, and it's pretty awesome. I would say that when I took the project, I was thinking it will be like a simple basic clone, but it's nothing like that. So you will see very soon.
Yeah, so I guess there's quite a few comment questions. So we're gonna get to
Okay.
that. I saw one around someone who was asking about a front end just now. So there's a question that is the front end easy for someone to follow who's never used the Vue? I know mainly React.
Okay, so about Vue, if you have used Angular, I think Vue resembles Angular 1, and there's some bits of React as well. So it's kind of a mixture. So I would say if you have any experience, so you mentioned that you have a React experience, I think that's enough. There's things that they are implemented in a slightly different way, but I don't think it will be a problem for you as long as you need to get familiar. And once you see how easy you can build on top of components, how easy it is to build using the approach from Vue, you will see that it's not that far away from what you have been using so far.
And I guess with Vuex, is that a very similar model to what you do with Redux?
Yes, that's the Vue implementation of Redux. So that will also be a good exercise to see how Vue core team has implemented Redux, which is follow very close to the original implementation.
Okay, so we got the question from Or about what happened yesterday in the US East one, which is obviously for those of you who haven't heard, there was a big outage yesterday in the US East one, where I think it was the Kinesis that was the first service that had the issue, and then that spread out to CloudWatch events. It affected the Cognito, it affected quite a few other services. So always question here is, should I duplicate my app to another region? Can I ask AWS for money as compensation? For money compensation, probably not. I don't think that was that's in the contract. But certainly for dealing with this kind of region-wide failure, because me and the Sans were just talking before we went live that. Now, with all the serverless components, you get multi-Z out of the box. So you are not affected by data center-wide failures. But what happened yesterday was a region-wide failure. So it affected the whole of US East 1, which means if you were running stuff in US East 1 and you were only in US East 1, then yes, you will be affected. So a lot of people, what they do is they have multi-region applications. So one of the best practices around the building resilient application in AWS is to have a multi-region active, so that people like Netflix, people like the Zone where I used to work, we all did the same thing, where the entire application is run from different regions, and as a user, you are routed to one of maybe 3 or 4 regions that we are running in. And if one of the region goes down, then your traffic gets routed to one of the other regions where it's still working, it's still live. It may not be transparent, so when the issue started, you will still see some impact, but at least the system will recover itself. So if you are, I guess the question is, how much of impact that outage has impacted you, and how much effort and the cost is going to have on you if you were to go multi-region. With serverless components like AppSync and like Lambda and DB, if you're using those components, then DynamoDB has got global tables, so you could replicate data across multiple regions relatively easily, and then you can set up Rule 53 in front of your either REST API or GraphQL API, so you can set things up in a multi-region setting fairly easily. But that is still going to be complexity in terms of deployment, in terms of managing the environments, in terms of monitoring, in terms of collecting all of your logs. So there is going to be overhead. The question is that overhead worth it for maybe once a year? There's a couple of hours of downtime because, or maybe less often than that. I think the last big one that was a region-wide failure was more than a year ago, and that was caused by, if I remember correctly, someone pushed the bad configuration to S3 in one of the I think it was US East 1 as well. That seemed to be the region that is always having trouble. It's always also the biggest region as well. So really the trade-off is how much is that downtime for a couple of hours affecting you in terms of your market cost, your reputation cost in terms of actual lost revenue versus the amount of effort you have to put into actually build a system that is multi-region. So good question, but it really depends on the return on investment you're going to get from going multi-region. My last company, my last full-time job, The Zone, they were a big sports streaming platform. So for them, it's super important to have uptime, especially when there's a big football match. A couple million people is going to sign in to watch it, and if your platform goes down, then you can lose the license, you can lose revenue and all sort of things. But yeah, it really depends on you. It's got a couple other questions. I'm just going to pick through them here. Okay, go on here. Another one from when I change my resources in the server, so YAML, your end-to-end test fails and have to first deploy the code, but in your pipeline, you run all the tests, so you need to manually comment them out, commit. So what I tend to do is I run a lot of these tests in some of the more, I guess, the dev environments where, okay, if I'm changing something, I can just run deploy from my local machine and then make sure that I run my integration test first. And for if you're using things like one of the practices I talked about is if you use a temporary stack for running end-to-end test, then this may be a bit better in terms of managing those the blast radius of making changes like the kind of things that you're talking about here. But yeah, this is one of the drawbacks of the way that I structure my tests. And let's see. Some more questions. Got a question here from Ganesh. It's about documenting the REST endpoints. Is there any way easier, like a Swagger, that we can use in the serverless for API Gateway and AppSync? I guess for AppSync, it's GraphQL, so it's self-documenting. In terms of other tooling, Sans, do you know of any other tools that you can use to take a GraphQL schema and maybe publish some documentation like you have with Swagger?
You can actually run, because GraphQL is auto documented, as you were mentioning. You can, as long as you have access to the GraphQL endpoint, there's some tools that will just draw all the relations and all the types for you. So that's, if I remember well, it's GraphQL Satellite, I think, and it will just ask you for that. You can also use the schema as a base, and it will just draw you the design for you. So that's a way of documenting, like showing the graph and the relationships between the types. If you are asking more like a text written documentation, that can also be the documentation generated by Graphql. So you could use that, and that will be HTML based, and maybe you can convert that into a PDF, for example. But yeah, these are the tools that I know of. But because you have these API and you can actually query for this documentation live using the endpoint, it's something that you can also program on top. So it will be live instead of statically generated.
Yeah, with AppSync, does it support those introspection endpoints?
Actually, there's let me see if I can find the URL so you can maybe show it how that works. Let me find it in a moment.
Okay, sure. With API Gateway, you can do that with, there's a plugin with the server framework called AWS documentation or something like that, that allows you to attach information to the API Gateway definition, endpoints definition, so that you can say for request, what's the schema. And with API Gateway, when you attach a request model, it also performs a model validation as well. It doesn't do that for the response validation. So when you attach a model to the response, it only goes into the documentation the API Gateway can generate. So with this AWS documentation plugin, I think it's called that. What you can do is it gives you another command that you can run with the server framework to say serverless document or something like that, documentation or something like that, which would then ask API Gateway, make API request to API Gateway to generate the documentation, and then it would download it for you. So it can do that with API Gateway, but with AppSync, it's kind of self-documenting already because it's a GraphQL. Have you found it, the sense?
Yes, I found it. So this is okay. If you can share my screen or you want to share the URL.
Go for
it. I remember it was GraphQL satellite. It's not satellite, but it's a satellite. But it's called GraphQL Buoyancy. And nice. And then what you can do here is you can go to these preset options. So you go to change the schema, and you can use the introspection. So basically, is a query that you can run in your environment, in your query environment. You can go to the console, run this introspection query, and then you will just paste it here in this input, and it will generate a graphic like this. And then you can use that as you can also add this. If you have a documentation website, you can also include this as part of your documentation. And it has some nice effects, so you can navigate through the connections, and you can see here it will do the navigation for you. So that's the tool I was mentioning.
Okay.
And the URL, you have it here, Jan, on the chat.
Yep. And got another question from all around how to set the permissions based on cognito group and IAM in order to have field level access. So let me just show you an example based on a project I've been working on so that you can see what that looks like. So the short answer is yes, you can. Share screen. Screen one. Okay, so with cognito, you can say the specific. You can see here that the specific. Looking for the okay. All right. So you can see that this particular request, for example, this operation can only be done by users in the admin group. And you can also say some other operations can be done by users in the different groups. And you can also do the same thing to say that specific query operations as well as types. So can be accessed by maybe someone using from a cognito group as well as someone with API key. And the same applies to if you say, I have IAM authentication as enable as well. So that means that you can have the same AppSync API being accessed by different, I guess, applications. You have your user mobile application that is using cognito. You have your backend service that's using IAM, and maybe some third-party services that's using API key instead. So you can mix the three of them together. You can also have endpoints that are completely open and public. You can do that as well. So there's a lot of flexibility that's built into how authentication that you have with AppSync. So that's a good question. And then I got one from Marco here. Which technical limitations and quotas of AppSync are the most problematic in the real application? I guess depends on the type of application you have. Most likely, the ones you're going to run into are related to throughput. So AppSync has got a default throughput of 1,000 requests per second, but that's a soft limit. You can raise that. There's also other things to keep in mind. There's a hard limit on the duration of a request, which is 29 seconds. It's the same as API gateway. 30 seconds. So if you have something that's long running, then you can't really use AppSync for that. If you can't guarantee that it's going to finish in 30 seconds, then there are some other patterns you can do for things like, okay, there's a thing called the decoupled invocation, whereby you make a request and then you get back like a location to say, okay, where the result is going to be. And then from the client's perspective, you can start doing some polling and so on. So those are probably the two most important ones to keep in mind. There's other things like the size of the payload you can send, which unless you're sending like a whole image or something like that, then there shouldn't be issue. I think it's a couple of meg. So if you're just sending JSON data, then hopefully it shouldn't be an issue. But something to keep in mind anyway. What else? There's a couple other ones as well around this. There's a couple other ones around the number of iterations you can, I guess the loops you can do if you're using VTL to iterate through lists and things like that. There's some limits like that, but those are not limits that I typically would run into. The most likely one you'll run into in production is going to, in a real application, what you need to scale is the number of requests per second. But that's a soft limit, so it's okay. So good question from Eduardo here. Is there any substitute that you recommend if you had to replace the VTL templates to work with AppSync? I was thinking if I had to use VTL in more complex scenarios. So if you need to write something that's more complex and you're not comfortable doing that with VTL, then just put a Lambda function. That's probably the simplest solution there. It's kind of your get out of jail free card, and you're gonna have some overhead in terms of there's extra cost, there's extra component in your architecture, so there's a potential cold start that can impact the performance. There's also some limits around the Lambda concurrent execution, so there's other things to keep in mind in terms of if you use Lambda instead of VTL. But yeah, if it's something that's quite complex to do and you're not comfortable doing that with VTL, then you can put them into a Lambda function. And I know AWS is going to release something next week, which is going to make this a lot less of an issue. So look for keep an eye out for that. We can't say too much about that, unfortunately. But by the time this time next week, hopefully will be announced. So question here: how to resolve the n+1 problem? Batch invoke is an option, but it's limited to a batch size of 5. So I guess it's more of a GraphQL, general GraphQL question. Do you have any thoughts on that, Sans?
Not really in the context of AppSync. What I found in my test when I was looking into how the VTL's templates behave is that the calls, they are batch. The resolvers, they are batch in groups of 5. That's what I found in my tests when running VTL. But that's my only knowledge about this.
Yeah, I guess one thing you could do in this case is instead of invoking a resolver for each item, you can potentially just have a nested resolver for the whole array, and then invoke one function for the whole array. That's potentially another option you could do. And then in that case, like you said, you can just have a one invocation, but then you got to do you have that one invocation that have to handle lots more things, and then the map. Essentially, I guess you'll be mapping one array into another with a Lambda function in that case. So I guess depending on a specific scenario you're talking about, that's probably the most what I would do. But yeah, bash invoke is really limited as an option. Okay, got another question from Marco. There's no custom authorization or authorizer like API gateway. Is there a workaround? The workaround is use a pipeline resolver. With a pipeline resolver, you can do. Actually, I think that's one of the reasons why they designed in the first place, so that you can do custom authorization stuff in that pipeline resolver step. So you can run another Lambda function potentially. Essentially, that's what you could do from a pipeline resolver, either run some retail template or so you invoke a Lambda function to do that custom authentication steps. One of the annoying things with using a pipeline resolver is that if you want to do this on every single query or mutation operation, then you're going to have to rewrite all of your resolvers and then make them pipeline resolvers, which is a bit of an overhead. So what I've done with another project with a colleague of mine is we wrote a serverless framework plugin. So what that thing would do is it will rewrite all of our resolver definitions and turn it into a pipeline resolver and include the first step as our custom authorizer function. Whereas the API gateway, you apply the custom authorizer on the API gateway level, so you don't have to repeat yourself. You don't have that with AppSync yet. So who knows what happens next week? Maybe something's coming. But for now, that's kind of the workaround to use the pipeline resolver. So got a couple other questions for Marco, but I think in the interest of fairness, I'm going to pick someone else's questions for now, and see if we can find someone. Okay, got spam mail. Nice name. Are AppSync subscriptions fast enough for use for chat? I guess this is probably something that you can answer, Sans.
Yes, they are very fast. I mean, this is one of the default scenarios, and we use. I mean, as part of the AmpliFi team, I can tell you that we use a chat application as very often. So that's completely a yes. There's also a few tests on the volumes that AppSync subscriptions can manage, and we published a blog post that was showing that you have up to 10, almost 11 million concurrent subscriptions in tests. So I think there's no chat that will get there. But yeah, the answer is yes.
Cool. Got another question here. Will you be using Elasticsearch in your project? So for this project, we are going to use Algolia, which is probably the closest thing you have to serverless Elasticsearch. Algolia is a very nice service. The problem, Elasticsearch has got direct integration with AppSync, but the challenge of using Elasticsearch is that you have to set up VPC, you have to set up all the networking around it, and then for the Kibana side of things, you probably also end up having to set up Cognito identity pool just so that you can have some authorization and authentication enabled for accessing the Kibana UI, and also you have to pay for the Elasticsearch node. So when you're working on a course, you end up having to pay for some resource that requires uptime. Whereas with Algolia, you just sign up to the service, you get an API key, you go for the free tier, and you don't have to pay anything. So it's just a bit easier to set up, and but ultimately, it does the same job. And I think personally, at least I find Algolia a bit easier to use compared to at least modern Elasticsearch, which is getting really complex. I don't know about you, Sans, but every time I look at the documentations, you're just getting more and more config options you can have.
I agree with you. I have, unfortunately, I have more experience with Elasticsearch, so I'm able to implement what I want using Elasticsearch. But what I've seen from Algolia looks really, really good and much easier in my experience.
Okay, we've got a question from Cheryl. Would push notification and chat be implemented in the AppSync Masterclass? So right now, I do want to introduce push with subscriptions, but more for the notification side of things, not for direct messaging. I'm not sure if we're going to get to implementing direct messaging. I want to, and I think we should be able to do that. It's just more of a question of how big the scope is going to get. We're probably going to get to it. Fingers crossed. But right now, the scope keeps growing. I'll do my best. But in any case, we'll definitely cover subscriptions and the push notifications. Use at least when we cover push the notifications center. Got a question from Lance. I know you listed the one reason for choosing YAML-based server framework over CDK is that not everyone is familiar with TypeScript based. If that is an issue, would you use CDK? So that actually not the reason why I don't use the CDK. So because my reason for not using the CDK is that I prefer things that are infrastructures to as code, the tools that are decorative as opposed to imperative. Whereas with I know YAML is not everyone's cup of tea. I get that, and also I think. But at least when you're using YAML, using CloudFormation syntax or server framework, everyone is using the same, writing the same code. Whereas if you let people write custom code, it's you can have different code that compiles to the same template, and I don't think that's a good thing. That said, I do think CDK is really powerful in some specific situations. Like, for example, when you've got a multi-tenant system and you need to, I guess, replicate part of your stack quite extensively, and you need to do a lot of, the templating, then the CDK is really good for that. It's really easy to template it, template the hell out of it compared to using something like the server framework or anything that's based on YAML. And there's also other cases where CDK is really powerful, is where you have an organization whereby everyone has agreed to use one language, and you can then capture a lot of the organizational norms and conventions and best practices into patterns and package them into packages that you can deploy. That you can publish to like an npm, like a private npm or some kind of repository, depending on what language you use, I suppose. And then we use it all around in every team. However, on the other hand, if you've got a company whereby every team can choose their own language, then something like CDK or Pulumi can be quite problematic from the governance side of things, because, are we going to support the same set of patterns for every single language, so that everyone has got the same, exact same patterns applied everywhere? And as a centralized, security team or governance team, now I need to understand and work with 5 different languages because one team want to use TypeScript, another team want to use Python. So that, depending on where you are with your organization, the fact that you can use a general purpose language is either a good thing or a bad thing. Whereas at least with YAML, everyone is using the same language for sure. So yeah, personally, I prefer tools that are decorative, so that everyone just express what they want as a desired state in YAML, as opposed to write custom code to get there themselves. Got other questions. Let's see. Go on from Jay here. What path do you suggest for the devs who want to transition from microservices and monolith background to serverless path? Some best practices, etc. So that's probably a bigger question than I can answer in the in whatever time we have. But I did a whole talk around 8 steps to, basically 8 things to consider when you move from when you try to refactor existing monolith to serverless. And I would say, when we talk about microservices, there's a lot of times you hear people kind of associate microservices with containers. I think that's wrong. Microservices is a way to identify, to say, I guess, to decouple your system and then establish boundary context, basically boundaries around responsibilities for different services, and then how they communicate with each other and all the patterns within that. It doesn't dictate that you use a specific technology. In fact, when I'm building microservices and I'm building stuff with serverless, a lot of the time I'm building microservices. I'm identifying boundaries within my monolith that I'm moving away from potentially, and identifying those boundaries and then creating services around them. But I'm implementing them with serverless technology components as opposed to with containers. In terms of path that I want to suggest. You go from monolith to microservices. I guess read a book by Sam Newman. He's got a new book, I think, called something like Monolith to Microservices. So it talks a lot about some of the common patterns and challenges that you will come across. And he's got another book around microservices, just I think one of the first books on microservices. So that's a really good book to read about, again, the common patterns and common challenges people have when they're building microservices. And then you can apply pretty much most of what you learn from those books when you're building serverless as well. So that's kind of a bit of a long-winded answer, probably without directly addressing what you asked, but it's probably a bigger topic than can be covered in a Q&A. Let's see. So got a question here from Amir, I guess. Hi guys, thank you for the course. I had a hard time understanding how Sam figured out the .env value. In other words, when you say Sam, you probably meant the serverless framework. So the way you figured out the values in the .env file is we had installed a plugin called the serverless export env. So that plugin is responsible for exporting environment variables that you have defined in your function definitions, as well as the output for the stack for your stack, and then export them to a .env file. And then from then on, in the code where we need to access the .env file, we use a package called .env, which if you see in our tests, we will have the required .env .configure. So that's how we were able to then load the .env file in our tests. Let's see. Let's go. A question from Jody here. What's the best practice for testing serverless locally? The best practice is probably to not do it. So I don't. Sorry, it's not a cheeky answer. I really do mean I don't mean don't test any of your code. As you can see from the exercise we've done so far, we are unit testing the VTL templates where there's enough custom logic in there to warrant writing unit tests for the VTL template, and we are unit testing functions that's got complex logic, which I'm not sure if we're doing that for any of our functions, but we are running the functions locally to check that it's talking to DB and doing the right thing using those integration tests. If you mean running the whole API locally, there's a couple of tools you can do that. So AmpliFi has got some tools to simulate AppSync locally, right? Sans?
Yes. You can do that with mocks, and that will open a server with a port, so you can use that endpoint as if it was the GraphQL API in AppSync live.
Yeah, and then with the API gateway, you can do the same thing as well. The server, Sam has got a invoke ability to let you run API gateway locally, and the server framework has also got a plugin called the serverless, or local or something like that, which does the same thing, lets you run API gateway locally as well. And I think the AmpliFi simulator for AppSync, I think someone also published an AppSync local plugin for the server framework, so you can do the same thing. So you can run a command to then run AppSync locally. But I would say that's probably, I wouldn't, well, that's not what I would do. And I certainly wouldn't try to run local stack for things like DB in order to run everything locally, because there's just too many different services you might end up using. And things like local stack and pretty much any tool that I've seen that simulate AWS services locally, they're never quite 100%. They're also quite brittle as well. Certainly, that's been my experience with local stack. It takes a long time to set up, and they break really easily. And sometimes you get false negatives because of bugs with the local simulator itself. And you get errors that never shows up in production in the real thing. So I find it much easier in most cases to just deploy a new table to AWS and then run my integration test against the deployed table resources in AWS. I find that to be a lot easier, and yeah, I've had teams spend weeks setting up local stack, having all kinds of problems, and along the way, while other teams just deploy their stack once and run their test and then moved on. So personally, I always try to prefer the path with least resistance. So got a I guess a comment from Roberto. You can use TypeScript for your server's config. Server framework has examples on GitHub. He has a better template on his Twitter. Yeah, sure. Go check it out. Again, I don't have any problem with the YAML. I know that a lot of people, when they're new to getting used to YAML, there's the white space matters thing gets you a lot. But believe me, you get beyond that. You get past that eventually. So nowadays, I don't tend to have that problem at all. So got a good question from Fakund. For which use cases will you not use AppSync? I guess the question is probably twofold. When you wouldn't use GraphQL, and when you wouldn't use AppSync, if you need to use GraphQL. So do you want to take the GraphQL part of the question, Sans?
Sure. So I would say that AppSync, is a managed GraphQL API, so that will limit your options to anything that involves GraphQL. So if you are not planning to use GraphQL, that wouldn't be a good option. I guess that's a lot of the APIs are not using GraphQL, I would say. So that covers a lot of options for you. But if you do use GraphQL, that will be the option to use AppSync. So then regarding of what solutions you would not use GraphQL, it just depends on what you are trying to build. There's some scenarios that GraphQL, just because it's fairly new technology, is not as good as, for example, other technologies like REST. And then it depends on, what is the implementation that you are after. Some of these gaps have been covered, like, for example, dealing with files or dealing with some special formats that they don't translate that well using HTTP. So that will be some of the limitations of GraphQL. But these have been worked on, and we can see new use cases implemented using GraphQL. So that probably is not the case anymore. So that's more or less what I think about this.
Yeah, I think that's roughly in line with what I see a lot as well. I guess for a lot of the clients I work with, I see people still use a lot of REST for internal services. Like you have, I guess, like you think about one of the big tech companies, their stack would be a lot of user-facing APIs, and then some middle-tier APIs, and then some really back-end APIs that the client will not talk to ever. So you probably have GraphQL for the client-facing side of things, and then you will probably still have lots of REST APIs for your internal services that doesn't have to make those complex queries.
I think probably binary. If you have to deal with binary, like low level information, like a row, you don't want to deal with any other types, like a blob, then probably GraphQL is not good for blobs or for binary format. But I guess that's also some limitation that you can maybe implement a special type. It's also depending on the support on the data source. So if you have a data source that will support you in that binary data type, then maybe you can get around it. But that's the only thing that I can think of.
Yeah, actually, sure. But for the AppSync, if you're using GraphQL and not using AppSync, there's a couple of things AppSync doesn't support from the GraphQL spec, and there's also things that Apollo is doing that AppSync doesn't do. Things like data loaders, things like schema federation. So if you really need those, then again, maybe you wouldn't use AppSync even when you're running GraphQL. So you'll be running like a GraphQL Apollo server in the Lambda function or something like that.
That's right. That's correct.
Okay, got a follow-up from Jordi. Doesn't it feel like you're coding a bit blind if you can't do hot reloads when working? So we're not saying that you don't test your code locally. We're just saying that you're not, you don't have to simulate, run everything as a simulation locally. So if you look at what we've done in the course so far, we're running most of our tests locally. Our unit tests for the templates for functions that's got complex logic, and then we're running integration tests for a lot of our Lambda functions. That's all running locally before we deploy. We just don't simulate the entire AppSync API, which you could do. It's just not something that when I want to test the whole API level, I'd rather deploy it and then test the deployed API as opposed to a local version of AppSync, because I want to make sure the IAM roles and lots of other things like that are configured correctly, and not just and which things, a lot of things that you wouldn't be able to catch if you're simulating AppSync locally and then use that as your end-to-end test. I'm not saying don't. I guess when I say testing locally, I meant testing your code locally, but not the entire GraphQL API itself, as AppSync API itself. Got a question around Apollo GraphQL client versus AmpliFi. I guess I'm using AmpliFi because it's it gives you all the Cognito integration, which makes the authentication stuff a lot easier. And since we're already using AmpliFi, it's got a GraphQL client already, so it kind of makes sense to use it there. I haven't really done much with the GraphQL client from what I haven't used the Apollo GraphQL client. Is there anything that's, I guess, in the GraphQL client in Apollo that's is not able to do with AmpliFi?
I mean, as far as I know, there's always, some dependencies that will be hard, to replicate if you change the client. Like, as you were saying, authorization is one of them. It's not that you cannot implement it, but probably it will take you some time. And obviously, when you are using AmpliFi, this is already, built for you, and you kind of don't have to worry about it.
Right.
That's the only thing. As a GraphQL client, I think most of the clients they have the same features, so that's something that I would say it's quite stable across the different options. But the main thing is when you go down to integrating with authentication and some of the dependent APIs, then there's no way you can find that in Apollo. So you will have to build those, which is not something that it cannot be done. It can be done, but maybe you won't find that missing gap that easily, and maybe you will have to implement it yourself.
Right. Yeah, in the actually in our test for the AppSync stuff, end-to-end test, we're actually using just a raw HTTP client from Axios and then building the blobs ourselves, so that I can show you. You don't have to use a GraphQL client. It's ultimately just HTTP. You can still use HTTP, and we even
that in theory that's a client.
Yeah, that's an inferior client. Yeah, yeah.
It's a
about
client. It's a code on the client.
yeah, it's learning the hard way, right?
Yeah. It's a very thin client. That's the only thing.
Yeah, but I guess things like fragments and things like that that's all supported on the AmpliFi as well as on the Apollo client. So yeah, there's I guess no particular reason to use the one or the other apart from the fact that AmpliFi works well with Cognito, and we're using Cognito for authentication. So it kind of makes sense for us to use the AmpliFi because of that. Some really good questions. Thank you, everyone. Got a question from Code Vision here. With tracing tools such as X-Ray and Lumigo improving, would you still use correlation logging in your project? I guess it really depends. If I need to ever log anything to provide additional context about what I'm doing, then correlation IDs is still going to be useful to have. It allows me to, I guess, link together logs from different places. But yeah, I hear you. I'm writing less and less logs nowadays because of the fact that Lumigo catches everything for me. If I show you some of my code, there's embarrassing lack of logging, which I think is a good thing because most of it is done by Lumigo for me now. That I can see the invocation event, I can see the request response for every single IO call my function makes. So I'm finding less and less need for me to do custom logging, and therefore less need for me to do all the things I've been doing before with correlation IDs and tracking them, especially now that Lumigo is able to capture events that are going through Kinesis, DynamDB streams, Event Bridge, SNS, and SQS. So yeah, I hear you. I'm doing less of it now, but until such a point that I can everything's supported, and I don't find myself having to log anything beyond I'm sending a request to EventBridge, I'm sending a request to DynamDB, then yeah, there's probably not much need for me to do custom logging and therefore correlation IDs anymore. Let's see, got a few more questions. Are we going to use AmpliFi in this course? So we are going to use AmpliFi, the front-end library in the front end, as we just talked about. And then the Sans are also going to show you how to host the whole application as a single page app in the AmpliFi service. We're not going to use the AmpliFi CLI. As you've seen already, we're using the server framework to configure all the cloud resources. But otherwise, so yeah, we are using AmpliFi for the 2 of the 3 components. Let's see. Okay, let me go back to a few more of Marco's questions because we kind of skipped it a little bit. So Marco says, how fast is AppSync compared to API Gateway? How fast are subscriptions compared to a pure WebSocket? I haven't done a live test against the API Gateway and AppSync. I would say both of them has got really low overhead. AppSync REST APIs, typical overhead is about 10 milliseconds, 5 to 10 milliseconds. HTTP API is supposed to be a lot lower, so probably closer to the 2 to 5 millisecond range. AppSync, I'm not 100% sure, but it's also hard to compare because with one GraphQL request, you can gonna get the equivalent of 5, 10, 20 REST API requests because of the fact that you can condense so much in one request. So the overhead is not exactly the same, but I would say that I haven't had any performance issues using AppSync so far. So hopefully that means even if it's not as fast, it's not slow enough that it causes a problem from the user-facing perspective. As for subscriptions compared to pure WebSockets, I'll leave that to you, Sans.
Oh, I just shared. Just as a follow-up, I shared a link. I was mentioning this before. So there were like some tests, and the results reach 10. I think it was 10.5 million active subscriptions. So then, I mean, probably to answer the question, we should check how much overhead GraphQL poses there to check, the subscribers and making the messaging, as opposed to just use WebSockets. But then I think that it will be fairly close. I don't see what will be slowing down subscriptions.
Yeah, same here. Let's see, got another question. Couple other questions from Marco. Let's see. What do you think of the approach of using only direct Lambda resolvers without VTL? The purpose to avoid VTL is another thing to learn and manage. To be fair, if you look at what we've done in the course, we haven't really written much custom logic in VTL, even though it's VTL template, but it's just taking a JSON blob, copy and paste it into our template file, and then changing the fields to match our table schemas in DynamDB. So if you're not using single table design and using multi-table design like what we've done, chances are your templates are going to be so simple that you won't have to write much custom VTL code at all. The reason not to use Lambda is that even though you can be much more flexible in what you do, and you don't have to write VTL code, but you also then take on all the other overhead of Lambda, like there's cold starts you got to worry about now, and now you have Lambda limits to think about, as well as the AppSync limits, concurrent executions, regional limits, and also the burst limit around Lambda once you hit the initial burst capacity. And then you also have to worry about additional cost, which may not matter based on how much traffic you've got, but still it's just additional things you got to think about when you're using only Lambda functions instead of using VTL templates to integrate with DynamDB and so on directly.
I would like to mention another aspect from direct Lambda resolvers is that you still have to manage the context. So when you are using BTL templates, you already have the context available, so you don't have to manage kind of marshalling or making this context available to your Lambda function. So that's something that maybe you have to implement. There's also helper functions that you use in your BTL templates that are not available because you have lost the velocity engine when you move that to a Lambda. So then you need to be aware of that. Of course, if you use very simple BTL templates like the ones that Jan is using, which are pretty simple, then your Lambdas will be also quite simple. But if they become more complex, then maybe you will have to implement some of the helper functions that you may be using in your BTLs.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a hard stop in the 3 minutes. I've got a client call to jump on. So one last question. Got a question from Barry last. Is there a point you would switch from multi-table to single table if you already know your access patterns? Yes. So where I think a single table design is going to give you in terms is the additional performance, the additional scalability and cost, all of which matters at scale. So if I know I've got something that's going to be really running at a really high scale because it's a port of an existing system where those small efficiencies really matter, then yeah, I would switch from multi-table to single table design. But until then, I will probably stick with multi-table design for as long as I can because single table design has got a cognitive tax on everything I do, and if what I'm getting back in terms of the performance gains in terms of the cost efficiencies is worth it, then yeah, I'll switch, but not for every single case. So yeah, so I think that's it. That's all we have time for. Thank you guys so much for so many questions. It's been great. So this is going to be available on the course as well, and also it's going to be YouTube, I guess. But yeah, hopefully we maybe do it again in a few weeks' time after reInvent. So yeah, see you guys next time.
Bye.
Bye.